We're going to get started on an island project, and on the front end of this project with the presentations, we're going to focus primarily on workflow. So I'm going to get this project started by creating a new project in Unity. This project is going to be called my island project. I'll just call it island. I'm saving mine to the desktop, and I'm moving the files and folders around as needed to archive them, but I want to save mine to my desktop so that I can quickly access this content. So this is a 3D project, and the assets that we'll be using, we definitely want to include cameras, characters. I'm going to include effects and environments, and also particle systems. Now remember, if you skip some of these, that's okay. We can come back and import this after the fact. So if you're missing something that I'm able to access during the presentations, I'll remind you of that process once we get into the Unity project. Now, we are going to be using Playmaker in this project, and I have access to Playmaker because I've been using it, but I'm going to leave it unchecked so that I can remind you of the process of how to access this through the asset store. Now remember, this is a required component that you were supposed to purchase. You should have purchased this already, but if not, you can purchase it before you get this project started, and I'll walk you through the process of incorporating it into the project, and we'll do that in a presentation or two. So I'm done. I'm going to hit Create Project. It's going to take a few minutes for this project to completely generate, so I'm going to pause the presentation, and I'll return when the project's ready. That took a few minutes, and through the magic of video editing, it should only take just a few seconds in the presentation. But now I'm ready to get started. Now, before I spend too much time getting this project up and running, I do want to point out a few things. I have my map folder somewhere. Lost my map folder. Let me go dig for that really quickly. Bear with me for just a second here. Okay, so I have my map file here, and I'm going to keep that organized. And I'm just going to open this up in preview. So I'm just opening up a JPEG, and I'm going to leave this in the corner so that I can reference it. And basically, for this project, I really just kind of want to generally reference my 2D map when I start sculpting the island. Now, I'm not going to spend a tremendous amount of time working out the details in this presentation, but I am going to take a few minutes and just kind of jump back and forth. So I'm going to get this project started in Unity by creating a game object, a 3D game object, and I'm going to create a new terrain. Now I'm going to let the terrain size default because as we experimented in our previous presentation, it seemed like a fairly comfortable size, I think. And we're going to put a finer point on that here in just a bit. So I'm going to zoom way out so that I can see this a little bit more clearly. Now, when it comes to the orientation in a 3D space, this is not an arbitrary thing that our y-axis is pointing up and our x and z orientation is in a very specific way. I have my terrain selected and I have my move tool. If I have an alternate tool selected, I get a different heads-up display here or a different little widget. I want to make sure my move tool is selected because what I'm interested in is seeing what the orientation of this object and the orientation of the world is in. And what I mean by this is that I generally want to look down the z-axis or in the direction of this blue arrow. And I'm going to do that by holding down the Option key and just orbit around so that I'm more or less looking down the z-axis on my map. Now, the reason I chose to do that is because the forward direction in 3D space is in the direction of the z direction. And I just want to get oriented, so I'm thinking of the positive z direction is north in my map, and that'll kind of help me stay oriented. It'll kind of keep me acclimated to my space. One other thing that I want to do, I'm going to just jump over to my preview here for a minute, is that when I sketched my map, my terrain is wider than it is tall. So it's like a 5x7 roughly. So I'm going to select my terrain, and I'm going to go into the settings, and in the width and the length, I'm just going to adjust the length of my terrain. I think that's going to be the X direction. I'm going to change that to 700. So it just changes the proportion of my terrain just a little bit. And that was definitely the direction that I wanted to modify. Okay, made it a little bit wider. And again, it's wide because I'm considering that that blue arrow, that Z direction, as north. Okay, so I know what the width of my terrain is. Now, I'm really quickly just going to kind of sculpt the basic shape of my island. And my island has sort of this almost like kind of distorted Pac-Man shape. It kind of looks like almost like a mouth or a turtle that's eating the island over here. So I'm kind of thinking this is like a big C shape. Okay, and then there's a little bit of nuance here with the way that this water comes in, but I really want to kind of establish the rough shape of the island first. And I'm going to do that by using not the raise lower terrain height tool, but I'm going to use the paint height tool. And the reason I'm going to do this is because I can control the maximum height of this brush. So I'm going to set this something to like 5. It's very low. I'm going to keep my brush size fairly high, and I'm going to turn my opacity way up. Okay, and so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to come in here and paint, and I'm just kind of trying to come in here and get that rough C shape. Okay, and I'm not going to overthink this. I'm just kind of really getting that rough shape in. And now it might be a little bit hard to see in the presentation, and I'll add some contrast to this by quickly getting some water and some textures in here. But that's roughly the shape that I'm going for. Okay, now I'm having a hard time seeing what's going on, even when I zoom in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the paint texture tool, and I'm going to add a simple dirt or sand texture, just like we did in the previous presentation. I'm going to find something. Here's the sand texture, and I'll double click to load that, and I'll hit add. So that gives me a little bit more contrast, but one of the things that's really going to make this jump out is if I add some water. So just like we did in the previous presentation, I'm going to go into standard assets. I'm going to go into environments, and that's where I can find water. And I'm just going to keep digging into the water folder until I see the prefab, and I'm looking for the water pro day, and I'll just drag that out into my environment. And like I did last time, I'm going to scale up the X and the Z. So I'll scale this up to like, let's say 1500 for now. And I can reduce that size later if I need to. Okay, now I'm getting some kind of funny like flickering when I zoom in and zoom out. And that means that I have two planes that are occupying the same spot. So the Unity is not quite sure what to render, the water or the sand, because they're occupying the same vertical space. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my water, make sure it's selected. I'm going to go find the y-axis, and I'm going to move that up by 1 meter. And once I do that, that'll kind of stop the flicker. Once I move that up just a bit, I've moved that up 1 meter along the Y. And if you remember when I was painting my terrain, I'll select my terrain and I'll go back to the paint height tool. I had set my height to 5, which means that the difference between the highest point of my island and the water is 4 meters, and I'll adjust that later. But I have a pretty clear sense of what the height values are. Okay, so once I get the rough shape of my island, I'm just going to jump back and reference this again. Now I'm going to start refining this a little bit. Okay, so I'll jump back into Unity. I'll grab that same tool I was using. I'm going to use a little bit harder edge of a brush, make this a little bit smaller. And I'm just going to kind of go back through and add a little bit of nuance. Now, if I want to cause this to recede, I can just slide that height down to 0. And then when I paint, I'm painting it back into the water. And so I'll just kind of rough out where I want, I think, that lagoon. And again, I'm just being really, really rough with this right now. That brush was probably a little bit bigger than I wanted to use, but I can just push this up to 4. And now when I come paint back in, I'll kind of raise that edge up. Okay, now this time around, I'm using a height of 4, so you can see I'm kind of changing the height value, which is okay, that's fine. So again, I'm just really kind of roughing this this shape. I'll take that brush size in and just really start to kind of create some nuance to the edge of my map. Now, once I get that rough shape, and I had a few little islands over here, let me just kind of bump this up a little bit. So I had an island here, maybe here, and I'll just, being really rough with this. That is the rough shape that I want my entire island to be. Okay, now before I commit too much time to this landscape, I'm just going to come through really quickly and create some real simple mountains. So I'm going to grab one of these textured brushes. I'm going to go into the raised lower terrain, And I'll keep my brush reasonably big, but I'm going to take the opacity way down so that I don't get super dramatic results here, because I kind of want to paint this in and I slowly want to build up the terrain. Okay, I'll look at this from the profile view, and that might have been a little too much. In fact, I'll go back to my map and I see here that there are some mountains over here that need to be pretty high. I started a little early, but that's okay. This map isn't etched in stone, it's just a reference. But I have kind of these mountains that skirt the island on the outside. So I'll just follow that through really quickly. And it's okay if I paint into the water because it'll just kind of raise that up. So I'm just really roughly painting this in. And again, I can be a little free about how I do this, okay? So there's my rough landscape. And I haven't spent too much time creating this, right? And the reason for that is that I want to get in my island and walk around and confirm that the scale is not too big and not too small. Before I do that, I'm going to edit and add some existing textures. So I'll grab something like this grass hill texture, and I'll add that. Now I got a second texture. And while I'm here adding textures, I'm just going to add a few more because I saw a cliffs texture where there's a grassy rock texture. That I'll use that one instead, and I won't worry about the cliffs. I'm going to take this grass texture. I'll grab a really soft-edged brush. The opacity is fairly low, so I'll come in here and I'll start to paint. And I'm just going to be really kind of quick and heavy-handed with this. I'll even make my brush a little bit bigger, and I'm just going to really get in here and kind of experiment with filling this up fairly quickly. Okay, I'll come back in and fix my beach later, but I just want to rough out the grass, because what I want is some contrast to my island, so that when I'm walking around I get a pretty clear sense of where I'm at. I'm going to jump into my rocky grass, and I'll just kind of paint the tops of my mountain really quickly. Okay, so I got about, maybe 5 minutes invested in my island. Okay, now I'm going to save what I'm working on. I'm going to choose File, Save Scene. I'm going to let the location default. Now just note that we're saving into our Assets folder. Okay, and if we remember, this is my project folder over here off to the right, the Island project. If I go into my Island project, there's an Assets folder. This is the place we're saving the scene into, and that'll start to become important a little bit later. I'm going to call this LVL01. It's my level 1 of my island project, and I'll hit save. Now, before I go any further, I want to go back and introduce my first person character just like I did in the previous project, so I can walk around my island and get a sense of the size and the scale. Not just the size of one end to the other, but I want to get a sense of the height of the rough mountains that I just created. Are they too high? Are they too low? I won't know until I introduce my first-person controller. So if I'm missing the water or the environments or the first-person controller, if I failed to import those in the beginning of this project, just remember I can go to Assets, Import Package, and from this list I can choose the things that I need. I'm going to use Characters, which I've already imported, but if I needed to, I could import that package and go to Characters. So inside my Characters folder, inside my first-person controller, inside prefabs, I'm looking for the FPS controller. I'm going to avoid the rigid body controller for now. We'll make a decision about which one's best to use in future projects. But for now, I'm going to stick with the simple FPS controller, and I'll drop that into my scene. And just as soon as I do, you can see that my camera is looking in a specific direction, and it happens to be looking in the direction of Z. So it's looking, I can think of that as looking in north, looking north. So now I'm going to save one more time with Command S or File Save. I'll hit the play button, and now I'm inside my island and I'm looking around, and I got a much better sense of how large my island is. In fact, while I'm here, I'm going to walk over to the edge and look down, and so the coast kind of drops right off as a really dramatic kind of drop off, which I don't like. I'll go back and fix that later. But I'm looking back here and I see, I'm going to hold down the Shift key and run, but I see these mountains. Now the mountains aren't huge, but the mountains are going to be difficult to walk up, particularly if I make them much steeper. So I'm just going to run up here for a minute and use this trick to kind of jump to the top of the mountains. And this is giving me a pretty clear sense of what the size and the scale of my island is. It's small, very small, but it's manageable. Okay, my goal is to make an adventure island or something that's very simple in terms of I got to get from point A to point B. I don't want to create a walking simulator. Okay, I don't want to create something that I have to walk for 10 minutes before I find the first point of interest. Okay, so I'm just going to run along this ridge line here, which in the future, I'm probably going to come back and modify because I don't think that I'll want the user to be able to hop up here. Maybe later in the map, they can get up a little bit higher. But for now, I got a pretty clear sense of what's going on here. Now, I can use a lot more of my terrain, but I want to be mindful that if I walk out here, and walk off into the lagoon, I'll drop into the water, and I can just kind of walk across the water, which is fine for now. But when I look back on the edge, okay, there's a really dramatic drop off. So these are some of the things that I'll go back in and fix from a workflow standpoint. But I think from a design standpoint, you got a basic sense from the previous presentation on how to kind of start to create the nuance of your island. Okay, so get your island started. The key to keep in mind is be mindful of your scale. Don't invest too much time in the design of your island until you decide that your scale is appropriate. Okay, make sure that you're referencing your original sketch. Okay, to get the rough shape. And even as I'm looking at this, I can see that, you know, if I really wanted to be true to this sketch, this kind of part of my island, this needs to kind of drop back. So, you know, I would go back in and grab my paint height tool because I got a lot of control with it. I'm going to set that to 0, and I'll just come back here and kind of paint that away. Okay, and that kind of gives me more of the shape of the island. Okay, and that's looking more or less like the shape that I want. So I'll spend some time refining this based on all the stuff that we looked at in our previous project, and just kind of work through it. Now, when we come back in the next presentation, I will start to talk to you about the basic mechanics of this project. Okay, so I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the design. We've talked about that in the previous presentation. I want to start to talk about the core concept and the playability of our island, getting from point A to point B, and some of the things that we might find along the way that could cause problems for us. But we'll talk about that in the next presentation.